Some of you may recall the name of an actress, rather prominent, a Broadway actress and Hollywood star, Ann Jillian, in the 1980s. Ann was exercising at her health club in San Fernando Valley and realized that she had some kind of growth and went to see her doctor and discovered, yes, it was cancer. She went over to her parish, which was St. Francis de Sales Church, and as she went into church to pray about all of this, she happened to look over the door, and words that were inscribed over the door that she had passed by for years sort of jumped out at her. And these were the words of St. Francis de Sales, quote, "The same everlasting Father who cares for you today will take care of you tomorrow and every day. Either he will shield you from suffering, or he will give you unfailing strength to bear it. Be at peace then, and put aside all anxious thoughts and imaginations." Unquote. Anne thought those words were directly addressed to her. It spoke to her powerfully. As she prayed in church, a deep peace came upon her. And as she proceeded to have her double mastectomy, all of the people were amazed at the serenity and the inner peace with which Ann Jillian battled this cancer. As we heard today in the gospel, there was a father who was desperate, Jairus, the synagogue official who wanted Jesus to come and heal his daughter, but the crowds were against him. They said, "Your daughter's dead. Give up hope." Public opinion was, forget about it. Jesus said, "She's not dead. She's sleeping." Right? It's not over. It's not finished. There's still hope. And they laughed at Jesus, like he's a lunatic. But we know, in fact, he is the author of life. And so did that woman who'd been sick for so many years. Nobody could help her. And yet when she touched the hem of Jesus' garment, instantly, power came forth. Why? Because of her faith. You see, it's not enough for that woman to stay in her home and say, "God, you do it." She had to act on her faith. She had to move. She had to put faith in gear and come forward to cooperate with Jesus. And so it was for Jairus, the father of that girl. If you've ever had a child, a 12-year-old that's gravely ill, maybe the child came down with leukemia, maybe this, that, or the other thing, and people say, "Well, I'm sorry, but there's no doctor that can help you." I remember going into the room of one of our second graders years ago who had just been diagnosed with leukemia, a very bad case of it. She herself pulled the covers over her head when I came into the room to bless her. I can only imagine, knowing her parents, the pain that they felt, and that they would have gladly said, "God, give me this. Why is this my child suffering?" Happily, that girl not only recovered, but is planning to become a pediatrician herself. It makes me think of a little boy, Louis, born in around the year 1800 in France. His father was a leather worker, and in the leather workshop, as a 3-year-old, Louis got into trouble, and some of his father's chemicals came into his eyes. Little Louis was blinded for life. 3 years old. What would you do, parents? You'd do anything for that child. His parents saved enough money to send him to a school for the blind in Paris. And while Louis was going to that school, there was a military officer who came to talk to them about something they used called night writing. Now, we couldn't imagine such a thing because we have flashlights. We've got ways to see in any occasion, day or night. They did not. And when you're in a battlefield, of course, a lantern brings a great deal of attention, and the enemy will fire at that lantern in your direction. So they came up with a way that they had raised letters, but they were symbols. See, in the blind school that Louis attended, everything was just raised letters. It would take about 15 minutes to read one paragraph, a short paragraph. But these officers had come up with a plan where they could read symbols and get a lot more information that were raised on paper, and that's how they did it in the battles. So Louis thought about that, and for years worked on coming up with a plan where instead of raised symbols, there would be punched holes. That little boy was Louis Braille. Millions of people, instead of cursing the darkness, Louis brought light into the darkness, and millions of people for 100 years since then have had the benefit of Braille reading because he took a dark moment in his blindness and turned it into light. People who cooperate with God's graces and God's inspirations bring light into the darkness. What will we do? Just yesterday, I went to a prayer service, an ecumenical prayer service for the friends of Father Golden, Graham Golden, the young priest who was killed tragically on South Cours, coming out of the monastery as he drove and was hit by a racer on that road. As I was going down the road for that service, all the lights were out. And it was sort of mass chaos. Imagine going down Cours, all those major intersections to get to the Abbey, and people, no lights, all the traffic, not even blinking, flashing lights. Everything was blackened. I had no idea about the tragedy of the balloonists who had struck the power lines earlier that morning and died as their gondola collapsed. Tragedies, so many tragedies. The number of teen suicides during this pandemic, astronomical. People losing loved ones, grief. There's a great deal of grief. Think of all the young people of different faiths that were gathered yesterday to remember Father Graham Golden, who had been really a hero to people of all faiths. And yet he was killed in that accident. How do we deal with all the tragedies? We can either curse the darkness or we can be instruments of light. Jesus is calling each of us to put our trust in him. What did he say to Jairus? Faith is useless. No, he didn't say that. Sorry, Lord. I retract that totally and completely. Fear is useless. Fear is useless. What is needed is faith. Right? Fear is useless. What is needed is faith. And that takes trust. Trust in God. We have lots of fears, but God triumphs in the end. So fear is useless. It really destroys our inner spirit. So when we're attacked by fear, what must we do? We must make acts of faith. In the letter to the Hebrews, it says, faith is confident assurance about things hoped for and conviction about things we do not see, the spiritual world. If we're limiting ourselves to the material world, what we can perceive with our senses, then, yeah, you have a good reason to give in to your fears. But if you believe in the spiritual world, the eternal world, by faith, you will be saved. The scriptures tell us that. And so I conclude going back to those words of St. Francis de Sales that Anne Gillian read, that little meditation that should strengthen all of us as we face the challenges of this life. Quote, "The same everlasting Father who cares for you today will take care of you tomorrow and every day. Either he will shield you from suffering, or he will give you unfailing strength to bear it. Be at peace then, and put aside all anxious thoughts and imaginations.